introduce, let's introduce our presenters. So we're so happy today, Elizabeth Aiken and Tony Benner with us. Elizabeth Aiken comes from a diverse healthcare background, beginning at the bedside as an oncology nurse, transitioning through hospital leadership and into quality management. As a coach and consultant, she has worked with teams throughout the New York City healthcare system in improving organizational performance through emotionally intelligent leadership, team development, and engagement. She holds certifications as an emotional and social competence inventory coach, a running coach, a mindfulness instructor, and is a member of the National Training Laboratory. And Tony Benner is an esteemed practitioner blending with over 20 years of experience in process improvement, people development, engineering research and design, and supply chain management in sectors including nonprofits, academia, automotive healthcare, and the military. Tony, a third-year scholar practitioner in the Doctorate of Organization Development and Change at Bowling Green State University, focuses on interprofessional team learning and its influence on engagement, quality, and innovation within organization design and learning health systems. And with that, I am so happy to pass the mic to Tony.
Well, welcome everyone, and I look forward to participating with you and sharing with you and collaborating with you, and along with Elizabeth Aikman. And so one of the things that we're going to talk about is catalyzing change. And one of the things that I would ask for a little bit of grace right now and a little bit of a moment. For some reason, I'm trying to share my screen, and it looks like there's some technical issue where it's not allowing me to share that screen. So I apologize up first. And we're just going to kind of roll through maybe some of these slides. If I can just have 1 second to try one more time in terms of sharing the slide, or if I can get some technical help there, that would be fantastic. And this is the nature of it. We're here this evening, thanking everybody to join us, being able to think about catalyzing change, and thanking Results Washington for hosting this evening. So if we can just have a moment to be able to put up some slides. That first slide, and we just want to kind of describe, was a little bit about my background. And one of the things I wanted to be able to express is my background in terms of learning as a researcher and a practitioner around organization development and change. That is really complementing and inviting myself to have a deeper understanding of lean and process improvement. And I look forward to, again, spending this next 50 minutes together, and I'm going to hand it over to Elizabeth to tell a little bit about her story and being able to think about lean and organization development and change, and kind of a little bit of a highlight of what we're going to talk about this evening.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. So first of all, so excited to be here with all of you tonight, and so grateful to Results Washington for having us here. Quick introduction to myself. Like Tony, I am also sort of at the intersection of practitioner and researcher. I have sort of a diverse background. I came from nursing, and I've practiced lean in healthcare. But throughout my career, I have always seen myself as a change agent, as I'm sure many of you have, no matter what hat you're wearing in the audience tonight. And so that really brought me into the research world to understand, how do we marry theory and practice, and kind of make those changes more immediate. And so some of that is really what we're going to aim to bring to you tonight. And so the first thing when we think about that is, what we always want to do is acknowledge that as soon as we say the C word, people get a little nervous. And so we just want to set the stage and walk through a quick agenda of what we're going to do tonight. Nothing is scary. We are very much going to create the conditions here to hopefully engage with you, even though there's so many of you out there and we can't see you. We have some different ways to do that and to draw you in. And so over the next hour, we're going to think about spending our time here just introducing at a high level the way that we see lean and the socio-technical lens that we take in approaching both change and the tools and how we engage with people. We'll talk a little bit about leading change, and we're going to move into developing co-creation, which is sort of something that's really deeply embedded in our practice, but that we've seen kind of emerging at the forefront of a lot of quality improvement work over the past year or so. And so we want to talk a little bit about the nuances of that. And then Tony and I are both really passionate about knowledge coming from experience. And so we always like to have a part of our talks that engages people in an activity and makes that very real for you. And so we'll do that tonight. or rather today, I just revealed that I'm on the East Coast. Nighttime for me. We will practice a little bit, and hopefully that sort of engagement, in addition to some of the things that we share with you, both from our researcher perspective and certainly from our practice perspective, are all things that you can walk away with and bring directly into your practice today, tomorrow, in the future. I'm going to hand it back to Tony just to kick us off on our very first sort of conceptual slide.
Yeah, thank you. And so Elizabeth just kind of went through the agenda. There's a visual there in terms of the getting to that, lighting up that light bulb and talking about how are we going to kind of deconstruct the time together. And then on this next slide, it's really hard for me to think about a lean conference, think about transformation, think about change without just taking a moment and thinking about the lean principles. And so one of the things I'd like to engage right away is when you talk about lean principles and we think about identifying value, you think about as a change agent, a process improvement consultant, you talk about any type of role that you're engaged in, defining value, mapping the value stream, creating flow, establishing pull, seeking perfection. This is just one of the many lean principles and quality improvement that are out there. So I'm curious if you take a moment to enter into the chat, what are some of the tools and methods that you currently use in your day-to-day to think about lean and quality improvement, whether it's value stream mapping, flow? What are the tools that you use to establish pull? What is the spirit in terms of seeking perfection? So let's just take a moment and engage everyone in terms of top of mind. What do you think about in terms of, there we go, there's some ideas coming up in terms of the tool-based, the methods. What does that look like in terms of defining value, getting those teams together and thinking about, wow, I've got in my backpack or in my tool, I'm going to have this type of method and or conversation starter, if you will. And that's what I'd like to kind of present here is we're thinking about lean and process improvement from a socio-technical perspective. I get pretty passionate and we'll be able to deconstruct that here even in the next slide. So as you're going through the chat and thinking about those tools, I want you to hold that thought in mind. And when we move to the next slide and talk about socio-technical systems, think about that tool that you have, and I want you to walk through with me at a very high level, socio-technical. Think about that tool that you're describing. Are you bringing together on the social side the people, the structure, their roles? Or are you really focusing sometimes potentially on the technical subsystem of social technical systems? High umbrella, are we thinking about workflow? Are you helping people develop a blueprint? Are we thinking about the technology that we may have? It may be a machine, it may be software. Think about other type of technology that you're trying to help bring change to. Are we trying to bring change to the blueprint? I'm walking through this visual that just deconstructs a little bit about the left side being social, the right side being technical, and then those quadrants of technology, tasks, partnering those with the people, the spirit of continuous improvement, heart-centered, people-centered change. And what does that structure look like in terms of your team engagement? So I just want to kind of stop here for a minute. You thought about the tools that you have, the tools that you're using, thinking about lean transformation, and then how do we bring that together as a catalyst for change? Reflect for a minute. We're going to open up a poll. I'm curious, what is your go-to? Which one of these quadrants do you typically enter in conversation or think about taking change? Do you enter in and create a point of conversation around the structure? Maybe it's very much your people-centered and you enter into change from the people perspective. How about technology? You think about how is it that we're going to go from technology A to technology B? How do we use technology potentially in a different form of fashion? One of the examples that I have here with the task, going into the operating room and some of my background in healthcare, what's the workflow? What does that look like in terms of the task and the work effort that we would kind of bring to that? So we're just going to kind of open up the poll here and have you reflect on which one's your go-to. Which one do you kind of enter into and what resonates with you in terms of social technical change and thinking about how to catalyze each one of these elements, appreciating that they're all integrated and they all come together. But typically there's one of these that's your point of entry. I want to pause there and ask Elizabeth, do you want to add anything in terms of we talk about lean social technical methods, people, and basically now bring it into social technical systems? Over to you for a minute.
Yeah, I love the way you just kind of brought that there at the end to talk about how, there really isn't a right or wrong answer to this. I think Tony and I come from, in our experience, our point of entry definitely is from the people side. But it's not to say that we're ignoring any of the other aspects, and the ultimate goal sort of is how do we make these things interact and how do we make them dance together. And so there's an aspect of just how do we stay aware of how we're relating and how we're moving between these aspects. I think the other thing to add is I certainly consider my entry point the people side. But sometimes there's a point in a project that I'm like, just give me a good spreadsheet, and let me sit in my corner and I don't want to talk to any more people. And that's okay, right? It's just how do we move between these things? So also interesting to see in the chat, some of those different perspectives, even before we open the poll. I think lots of different things surfacing. I'm looking at the results of the poll now, and I think we're amongst friends here, 48% leading with the people. That makes us excited. And I think we'll have lots to talk about. We're opening this talk with a little bit of like the technical side of things, but certainly when we talk about change, we are going to move into very much talking about people. And then interestingly, only 13% focusing on technology. Really interesting to see. I think if we were doing this even 5 years ago, I think maybe that would have looked differently. And structure and tasks coming in close there, each at 20%. So a good mix of things. And, that's one of the things that I think we want to talk about too, is, how then when we're thinking about change and we're thinking about kind of all of those different views that maybe we have in a room like this or in a room with a team that we're working with, how do we move into seeing the perspective of those things as the diversity of thought that we're looking to leverage? And so on the next slide, we have a visual kind of something that also can stimulate diversity of thought, but I think that's very much what just happened in the poll. And so in our practice, we like to think of diversity of thought as one of the greatest assets to catalyzing change. And so I think that's something that often we like to think about kind of talking about and saying, oh, this is great. We want all the opinions in the room. But really sort of in our subconscious, a lot of times the way we approach diversity of thought is actually from a space of how do we navigate, how do we overcome diversity of thought, right? How do we move more quickly to consensus rather than saying, how do we see diversity of thought as something that can be an asset to our advancement? And so we wanted to step back and just think about what diversity of thought actually is, also for anybody in the room that's like, what are these people talking about now? And so this is a nice visual to think about, when you see in the center here, this blue object, and you see all of these people standing around it, you see all of the possible different ways that people kind of looking in on the same object can see that object. And so when we think about that, we can think about our meetings and our projects and how that can throw a wrench in things sometimes and make things more challenging. But it's also the space that we can move towards innovation and towards like ultimately change, because it's what actually lets us contextualize other conditions in the situation to be able to say, hey, there's a possibility here. Maybe I could take a right turn instead of a left turn. And so how do we move into seeing that as an asset rather than something to overcome? Tony, what would you add there?
I would just take a minute and describe the slide a little bit. So if you happen to think about there's an object in the center and you happen to have this circle of 7 to 8 people around there and this object then, and there's this thought bubble above each one of the individuals in terms of someone seeing it as an 8, somebody's seeing it as an infinity diagram, somebody's seeing it as a wave or a pretzel. And in DNA, there's all of these different perspectives. So I just wanted to take a minute and actually describe why we chose this slide and why we're sharing the story of if there's 7, 8 people, typically we actually have 7 or 8, maybe 9 different thoughts. I know I'm conflicted myself sometimes in terms of, oh, wait a minute, am I looking at it as A or B? And so thinking about diversity of thought, even within ourselves. What does that look like within our team? What does that look like within the organization? And I think it's a pinnacle part to think about when we talk about catalyzing change and actually using the tools that we mentioned in that first few slides. So I just wanted to pause for a minute, describe the slide and think about, wow, what role does perspective take? in terms of identifying diversity of thought and the value of having diversity of thought and the different perspectives that we can rally around. As an engineer, as someone who's doing quality improvement, someone from healthcare, someone who's in the office, whatever that looks like in terms of your team, and how do we really honor diversity of thought in our role as a leader to be able to put voice to that, not just allow it to be in our head, but really put it out into conversation.
Amazing. Yeah, and so I think this slide is also inviting us to think about this at the individual level. And so, how is my perspective maybe different than Tony's, or maybe different than any of the people that are listening to this right now? But the invitation is also to think about, on the next slide, we talk about how do we not only widen our perspective as individuals, but how do we widen our perspective in an organization? And so what does that look like when we start to recognize, maybe Tony and I have different perspectives that can move something forward, that can open my mind, that can open her mind, that something else emerges beyond what both of us are thinking about. But what does that then look like in collective when we take that to an organizational level? And we think about sort of the networked aspect of organizations and how those sort of small interactions can shift the potential. And so I know we're at a conference about transformation, right? And so it's easy, I think, to start to think about change as almost something small, right? I need to go, I need to help, I need to implement change, I need to catalyze change, right? But what we're really talking about here is, what do things look like at scale? What is that kind of change that, we sort of can only dream forward, but we can only understand in hindsight? And so when we begin to see diversity of thought and different perspectives as possibility, and we create the conditions for those to emerge, that's when we can actually move towards that concept. Tony, what else would you add there?
I would love to add in this particular, we're talking about widening the view. We're talking about widening the perspective when we think about change. And I love somebody gave me an opportunity to kind of look through some of the chat here in a second. And there's a few comments about, yes, both technical and social. What does that look like when we're focusing on the structure and we actually want to bring the people back together? So what I would like to pause a moment for and really reinforce is the fact that as an individual, we have a role in the collective. And in the collective, when we think about change agents, how do we connect? What's the relationship piece? And thinking about, wow, I answered, I want to start with people, or typically I start with people. So what is it in terms of our role when we think about catalyzing change, that we bring people together? It's very relational. And I think being able to have that at the forefront and think about the people perspective of that, it's coming up in the chat when you do a value stream map. As a facilitator, are you holding the marker, or are we handing it off to someone else? Think about those handoffs. Think about the tools that we use and how do we create a network of people and be able to surface many ways diversity of thought. So just kind of staying here for a minute and thinking about the voice of the customer and the voice of the ecosystem in terms of how relationships and conversations bring us together, or they can separate us and keep us apart. But we have choice in the design, and we can be deliberate about the actions that we take to bring the collective together. And I think that brings us into kind of navigating a little bit of uncertainty. That's hard. That's challenging. So I'd come back to you, Elizabeth, in terms of that was my perspective to kind of add into widening the perspective and views.
Yeah. And so it's a good segue. I think in the next slide, we wanted to acknowledge that, Tony and I both are very passionate about this work. We take change very seriously. We see change from the perspective of an invitation, both, I think, personally and professionally. But the reality is that not everyone sees it that way, right? We talked about how as soon as we bring out that C word, people get a little queasy. And so that's because the reality of change involves us moving towards uncertainty, what's uncomfortable. And so, we wanted to also hold space here, I think, to acknowledge that in these first few slides, we are definitely putting on rosy colored glasses. We're talking about how we can leverage diversity of thought, how we can have better relationships, how we can just seamlessly move into change. And that is not necessarily how it always goes, because we have these big U words that are also kind of in the mix there. And so some of that is about how do we take these micro actions to also move towards the mindset where we are inviting change. We're expecting uncertainty, and whether or not we're comfortable with it, it's something that we are actually moving towards rather than allowing it to overcome us. Because as soon as it overcomes us, it's also very challenging to move into that space where we can leverage different perspectives. It shuts us down from sharing our perspectives. It shuts us down from receiving others' perspectives. And so, some of what we're going to talk about today is being in this space. And we're going to share a little bit of a tool with you in a couple of slides that I think is very helpful to help ground us when we're in this space, sort of in this in-between space, in this, I'm not sure what's going to happen next, and I'm on the precipice of something. And so how do I see kind of what's around me to give me some bounds to feel like I kind of know what's going on? And sometimes that's all you need to be that anchor and to allow some of the conditions for change to emerge. What did I miss, Tony?
I don't think you missed. I want to honor actually when we work together, both in our coaching and our facilitation, inviting change, I think, is one of the important foundational pieces. And Elizabeth, you do this beautifully to be able to say, wow, if we think about inviting change and creating space, let's just name what it is to be uncomfortable about. What is it that we are known or unknown? And then being able to dance with people in uncertainty. I think that that's what we're talking about, is how do we start breaking down the barriers, even when you're scoping the project? What does that look like in having a conversation? So I've seen you do this in terms of setting up the coaching calls and being able to kind of move through, whether it's the value stream map and process mapping, and really trying to get knowledge and the subject matter experts to engage. It's about navigating, if you will, and the compass that's kind of leading us through this little maze of like, what's too uncertain, what's unknown. So I just wanted to mention too, this is very actionable. It's one is, how do you create awareness around it? How do you bring it into conversation? And this big piece of being able to invite change rather than being forcing change upon somebody. I think this is a game changer. And I've seen you be able to do it with clients in your coaching. And I think it's an important part to be able to stand with and stand at the edge of change, invite people to walk with you on what that might look like. So I think this is at the individual level, but I think there's another opportunity now. Think about inviting change into the collective again. So maybe on the next slide, we can even talk a little bit about how you put that into practice and what that looks like in the organization development space.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. And thank you for that. And so, I think, in my work, I do a lot of work in coaching and also consulting. And, there's, like Tony's saying, there's a little bit of, there's a gift in that, because you get to work both with individuals, and you get to see people go through this process. And then eventually you get to say, wow, I'm going to step back from this bigger organization and this complex thing. Not that humans aren't complex, but how am I going to see those same things when I look at an organization? And, my experience of that is also that it still is rooted very much in saying, where am I standing right now? Am I the person who's coming and carrying the ladder? Am I the person who's trying to put this light bulb together? Am I the person with the checklist? And so, in learning to do that, I think that also allows us to better see where other people are standing, and to understand what that's like and how you can help kind of walk them through. And the other, I think, really critical aspect of this is thinking about then how do we stand outside the fishbowl, sort of as change agents, know where we are, be able to see where others are, and then be able to actually say, I'm not going to walk with that person, but I know where that person is, and I know where this person is, and how am I going to help those people walk together? And so I'm actually going to pass this back to Tony, because I'm very appreciative of Tony's comment about my practice. Tony is and really an expert in team learning, and I've also seen her do this, what I would call almost ignite teams, and do this quite in quite a special way. And I think that's actually what, in lean transformation, working with teams and working towards improvement in general, I think that's what we're all aiming to do, right? Is how do you light a little bit of a match in a group of people and see them dance? And so maybe Tony, you'll also share a little bit about your perspectives on
I think this one's great. When we think about bringing it into collective, when we think about being in a relationship with others, it's very much borrowing from improv, right? What does that look like to light people up? What does that look like to do a self-reflection, to think about, am I bringing in this ladder? And what does that look like to lift as we climb? What does that look like to be able to think about putting a piece of the puzzle together and really lighting it up? And what I wanted to emphasize here too is when we think about catalyzing change, when we think about leading change, it's not a solo effort. How is it that we help each other? How is it that we coach each other? How do we be thinking partners together? It's really challenging to think about sometimes the daunting piece of going in every day and thinking about solving problems. How do we flip that in terms of being able to light everybody up and think about, well, we're coming in for opportunities. We're coming in for what better may look like tomorrow. We're coming in together to be able to support the unknown of what may end up unfolding in the next 8 to 10 hours. So when we think about organizational performance, this is also an invitation to kind of hold the dashboard in terms of your outcome metrics and be able to play with change, with work in progress, with the process metrics. What does that look like in terms of whether you have a huddle? What does that look like in terms of the work that's currently happening? And really thinking about change as a verb. What does that look like in terms of performing together in the moment and being able to, again, very subtle examples. How are decision makings supporting catalyzing change? What does that look like to make sense of the work activities that we have now? And how do we give sense to the team who's also trying to understand what's going on in the day-to-days when strategically we're a leader looking out on the horizon? It's a challenge to be able to be in that space to think about a better tomorrow when you're trying to navigate the firefighting of today. And so what I want to think about is reflecting on the action pieces. What's actually happening in your day-to-day that are enabling conditions to co-create, to really think about experimenting different, being able to think about performance, both in terms of in the moment and outcome metrics that will maybe later on lagging in terms of changing that dial or seeing change from a different perspective. So just reinforcing again, it's a team sport. And what does that look like to think about change from a team sport? And one of the things I think is really fun, we're going to get academic here just for a moment and think about how does theory, how does history, how does thought leadership play in helping us to inform leading change, the role that we have and where we should keep our eyes on different elements within the organization. So I'll come back to you in terms of walking us through the change equation and kind of walking us through a little bit of that academic piece of our guide, if you will, to putting it into action.
Yeah. So, I love what you just said, and I actually want to pause and acknowledge where we are sort of in the presentation. And, at the end of the day, the idea of change is an abstract concept. And so, some of what we're doing here is inviting you into that abstract space. And so it's oftentimes also a good space just to reflect, like, how do you feel about that? Right? How do you feel about the first half an hour of this presentation that we've kind of talked about very high level things that we haven't quite grounded yet for you? And so in that space is oftentimes where change happens. This is exactly the uncertainty that we're talking about. And so it's not right or wrong if you're like, whoa, I don't even know what these people are talking about. But it is something to be aware of, because maybe that is how you also interact with change. But because we're people, we're also going to ground back into something a little bit more tactical. And so earlier I mentioned that we would give you a little something here to walk away with and to help kind of harness some of those abstract ideas. And so in the work that Tony and I have done together with organizations, we really, really use this change equation a lot, both in working with executives and teaching teams about it, but also very much in our own practice. And so what we often have the opportunity to do is get really deep in the details with people and then step back together and say, let's reflect on that, but also let's reflect against what we're ultimately trying to do here, which is kind of move that needle and create change. And so the change equation is, like Tony said, an academic concept. It's well researched. It's actually from the 80s, from two authors named Beckert and Harris. And so the change equation tells us that change happens when we have the combination of dissatisfaction with our current condition multiplied by a vision of a preferred future, multiplied by the first steps towards that vision, and when that overcomes resistance. And so some of the things to be aware of here are that the R here at the end, the resistance is ever present. The resistance is never going to be zero. Like we said, change is hard for people. It involves moving towards uncertainty. And so one of the ways that we first like to approach that is moving away from the idea of change management, that change is something to be managed, that change is something to be implemented, that change is just this action that we do, but rather seeing the conditions that we're in as ever evolving. Change is happening around us, the resistance exists, as do the ideas, the dissatisfaction, the vision, and the first steps. And so the other side of the equation we also want you to be aware of is multiplied. And so if any of these things effectively become zero, the resistance will overtake and you will have no change. And so, you know, sometimes when people look at this, they say, well, that isn't all too hard. I am very unhappy with what's going on here. And this is how I would like it to be. And this is how we're going to do it. And oftentimes those conversations surface when we are having a conversation with one person. But in an organization, the concept of change asks us to invite many people into that conversation. And so, you know, it's also about making sure that, you know, vision is a good example where what really constitutes a vision, what constitutes a shared vision, right? So you can have a whole room of people that are visionaries. It doesn't necessarily mean then that in the direction of change, we already have a vision, right? How do we connect about that? Like Tony was saying, a lot of this is very relational. And how do we come together to make the left side of this equation more powerful than the right and overcome that resistance? What would you add, Tony?
I'm excited, actually. Let's try it on. Let's try it on. We can talk about dissatisfaction, being uncomfortable. And I actually have just this past week was working with a team in academics, and it's reminding me, let's walk through this one together. And so you should have a handout to be able to walk through. And we're going to walk on the next slide through. Let's take a few of these elements of the change equation. Let's kind of go through it together. So what I'd like to do is think about the means and ends of change. How is it that we work? So I want you to think of a concept right now, or potentially a project or a work effort, or maybe it's something even in your community that you're thinking, wow, there's an opportunity to change something for the better, whatever that may look like. And so let's kind of deconstruct the equation a little bit. I want you to think about the people part of it, that social technical side, starting with the people, starting potentially with yourself. Here's the opportunity. On that worksheet, you can take a minute and just kind of write down the questions I'm going to ask and walk you through, or if engage with us, put it in the chat. I mean, just you can go over to the chat and think about, wow, what type of people, what roles potentially are you thinking that you're working with? Maybe yourself in terms of your role. What is it in terms of maybe some of the team members that you're working with? Let's just pause for a minute and think about walking through the people part of this change equation. I'm going to pause just for a minute. I'm going to hold space for a minute. You can write it down. It's something maybe even within your family, something in terms of the team that you're trying to facilitate to be able to make a change. You can either put it in the chat, write down for yourself. I want you to think about those people. What role might you play in terms of influencing this, right? Describe maybe in 3 words. How would you describe that vision? What is it about that future that you're working with that team? Is it clear? And even in the chat, here's something to think about. That vision, is it shared? Shared, not shared? Is it visual? Think about our visual management. What does that look like in terms of what this vision may be? If you think about the ecosystem, right? There's all kind of examples. What is it? Sometimes the vision is just to have teamwork. There's a vision in terms of we're going to be agile and work through deploying a new software. Think about the roles and the people. There we go. We're getting some momentum now. Here, think about the change equation. Momentum breeds momentum. That's bottom line what we're trying to do. Who are the people that are going to be involved in that? What are their roles? How do you get them to come up with a shared vision, something that is resonating with the head, heart, and hands of what the future might look like? I can rally around that, because now what happens when we put people and vision together, this is where, as change management, we've got to watch out, because the momentum starts to build. And now the first steps, this third element that we're working on right now, really starts to build traction. But what has a little bit of a caution: when we think about the first step, you need to think about your learning style. You need to think about, how is it that you're presenting? Some people actually prefer to study. Think about PDCA. Some people need to study before they take action. Some people need to be able to just talk about it and socialize it before we take action. So I love this, right? So if you're a coach, if you're a student, the organizational piece of that, think about the team that you're working with, and how do you get alignment and momentum to try and experiment with that first step. So we just walked through a few of those elements. And again, you can do this on your own, do it with your team. We're trying to give you a little bit of a method in terms of thinking about change, catalyzing it, and thinking about, wow, okay, who are the people that we're working with? Think about this as scoping change, if you will. Who are the people? What is it that we're trying to achieve? Are we all in agreement, or do we have the diversity of thought that really can enhance and elevate that vision? How is it that we collaborate very much on that first step? What does that look like to be able to do and put it into action? That's what we're inviting you to think about this evening. Think about these elements. Think about, how is it that you're influencing change? What that might look like in terms of a better tomorrow. I'll pause there. I know I got pretty passionate and excited. We were able to see how this really works with teams. So I wanted to bring it into everybody's day-to-day activities. But Elizabeth, do you want to kind of close us out and move us into why this is so important? You want to add in?
Yeah, I'm excited too. I love seeing some of the stuff in the chat, and the different ways that people see themselves is just, I really connect to that. I think this type of work, it's also so important to really think deeply about, who you are in your organization and how you're showing up. And so I think that brings us actually nicely into the next slide too, where ultimately, what does all of this boil down to? And so I think I mentioned earlier in this talk that, in our practice, one of the things that we are really passionate about is the idea of co-creation. And so, when we think about co-creation for catalyzing change, we what we're talking about is, again, how can we surface more and more diversity of perspectives? Because as we do that, we exponentially increase our potential for valuable collaboration. And why is that? Because then we have more possibilities for which we can collaborate on. And so there's actually a question in the Q&A that I saw that is talking about having a disdain for constantly talking about change versus taking actionable steps to form change, and asking if that is a form of resistance. This person says they just like to do their part and do it well without constantly having high-level meetings about it, if that makes sense. And whoever you are, I am with you. And so this is actually right at the center of what it's all about. And so it's that little mind shift also of remembering about yourself sort of as a change agent, and seeing that we all come into organizations and we want things to be better. We want to achieve that thing. We want the KPIs to click. We want to, X, Y, Z, you name it, right? And so what co-creation is about is also stepping back from that and saying, we may not be co-creating the thing at the end, but rather we're co-creating the space and the conditions for collaboration, for diversity of perspective to surface, and seeing that as success. Tony, what would you add there?
I'm going to add, actually, if I had a highlighter, right, this whole power curve, what does that look like to really leverage diversity of perspective? And what does that look like in terms of highlighting potential? Elizabeth just answered that question, I think, in terms of how is it that we ignite potential? What does that look like to be able to collaborate and be able to put it into action, right? So that's so important when we think about, on the next slide, I think it invites us very much to, how is it that we shift that perspective? Slowly, together as an individual in the collective? How do we hold on fixing problems and think about possibilities and igniting what that looks like? And I think that really requires us to be able to think about our skill sets of listening, asking questions, feedback, reflection. All of that really creates a space for us to change our mindset, to also be able to stand there at the edge and saying, here's what I think today. Here's what I think tomorrow. Here's what I want to do as we put that into action. This is nothing more than inviting us into that growth mindset. How is it that we walk together and make things very actionable? And I believe in my heart that also conversation is action. When you start in that collective and connecting relationships, connecting people in conversations, again, that's where momentum starts in terms of, yeah, let's try that. Let's move into some of the conditions that help us take action. Anything in terms of perspective before we move into co-creation, Elizabeth?
Yeah, I think just, I think about this a lot in my coaching practice too, is just the same idea is like it's perspective of yourself, of what you're looking at, right? When we're coaching someone, often people come to me and they say, I want to do X, Y, Z. Sometimes I coach athletes, right? I want to run a marathon. Okay, good. We're going to get to that thing, right? But as a coach, my lens is not to say, I'm going to come in and change this person's mindset. It's not necessarily, I'm going to come in and this person's going to achieve X, Y, Z. It's how am I going to create a little city around this person, right? And that they're going to have all these different places to stop at. And on the way, maybe at the end, they'll run the marathon. Maybe at the end, they'll get the new job, but they'll have stopped at all the stores in between. And there'll be all this other growth in between, right? And so it's not just about how do we shift others' perspectives, it's also about how we shift our own. And so, some of that is just how do we look at the different lenses and the different possibilities in organizations that are some of the very things that actually make them complex and they live in the human aspects. And so with that, I think we also want to talk a little bit about just those conditions for co-creation. So again, grounding it in very, very real. On the next slide, we've highlighted 4 of them, many of them which you are probably all familiar with, but are also very personal and nuanced in how we take action towards them, right? So they are a practice of the self and something that also happens in experimentation, right? Because if you work in an organization right now on team A and next month you work in an organization on team B, those dynamics are not going to be the same. And so you're still going to have to test the waters and say, how do I move the needle here? How do I create a collaborative team? A team is not a team, is not a team, right? What does psychological safety look like here? What do I know about the history of this organization? Why do people behave the way that they do? I come here with what I think is an experimental mindset. But maybe I just arrived at I don't know, IDEO or something. And I'm like somebody who's like really close and they're like, wow, she's not open to anything. So it's all about also being aware, fostering that awareness of where am I standing? What environment am I in? And what's that tiny little action that I can take to start to move that needle? Tony, what do you want to say about the conditions here? This is definitely your space.
This is our space, and this is the space of everyone here this evening. So I'd like to engage one more time in a poll. If we think about psychological safety in terms of that foundational piece, how are we cultivating the experimental mindset? What does that look like with a deep dive into fostering awareness? We think about what's one thing that you're going to focus on as you develop co-creative space? We gave you a little bit of a gift in terms of the research says that these are some of the elements. There's obviously others. Take a little bit of a poll here. What we'd like you to do is this is more for your self-reflection as we get ready to kind of wrap up this evening. Which one were you going to focus on? This is a scoping question. Difficult to bring them all together in terms of the conditions. Psychological safety, maybe. Experimental mindset. And what does that look like in terms of fostering that trial and error? What does that look like in terms of fostering awareness? We're talking about emotional intelligence here in terms of self-awareness, self-management, other awareness, in terms of managing others, leading others. What does that look like? This is, again, one of the research areas that Elizabeth and I are playing with is how do we develop and design collaborative teams? What are the elements and conditions to be able to do that? How do you bring people together to honor diversity of thought, diversity of perspective? And that's where the magic comes in. So just take a moment and think about the poll. Which one of these might you focus on? What we're inviting you into is the second page of that handout. What's one small thing that you could do in the area that you're focusing on? What's one bold possibility that might come out of or result or be impacted? So this is kind of our takeaway. Again, we're coming to the end, but think about that one thing that you might do to help create conditions for co-creation. It's one of the best ways to think about catalyzing change, and use that little bit of a guide in that worksheet to think about what's the one action that you're going to put in place quickly and within the next week in honor or service of what bold possibility and the reason why that you might do that. So Elizabeth, I just kind of kicked off here the poll and kind of the takeaway. Do you want to kind of synthesize that and kind of bring us home and close us out for the evening?
Yeah. I think maybe we just give a couple minutes here. The poll results are coming up, I think. Dun, dun, dun. Okay, I love it. Yeah, 36% looking at psychological safety, really important. One of the people Tony and I look to in that space is Amy Edmondson. I'm sure many people are familiar with her work, but all of this are things that also you can unpack too, that there's depths and depths of research on all of these concepts. And so we would also encourage you to go in that direction. Collaborative teams coming in second at 31%. Experimental mindsets only at 18. I'm surprised by that from this group, actually. And fostering awareness at 14. And then just a 1% in the other. I'm so curious what that idea is. I will put no pressure on anyone to put it in the chat, but if you want to, I would love to see it. That is one of the things that Tony and I love most about doing these things, is that we get to hear all of your thoughts and ideas. And really practice what we preach, because much of our practice is made on how we've interacted with organizations and individuals like yourselves and how we have learned our way forward. And then just married that into what we do. And so it's a gift, I think, to interact with you. I think that actually brings us to our last slide, which is a quote that keeps Tony and I together, very grounded, and we hope it will be a gift to you to remember this presentation, that there are others out there like you thinking deeply about change and how we do that and how we use ourselves in that space. And it is from Henry Ford: coming together is a beginning, keeping together is progress, and working together is success. And so I think actually that is a beautiful segue to the one question I also see in the Q&A that says, could a first step be to apologize or repair, etc.? And I really love that. I love it, first of all, because a first step can be anything that makes you want to move your foot forward. One of the other things that Tony and I really believe deeply in is a concept actually from Kurt Lewin. It's called the hodological path. And so it is the idea that until we step on the path is not necessarily revealed. And so there is really no wrong first step. The idea is to be alive and present in our interactions such that those first steps can be meaningful. The other idea that I love about this question is the idea of a first step being to apologize or repair. And I think one of the perspectives that we like to take is, how do we move forward through creating connections and through enforcing those connections and strengthening those connections. And so if I was working with whoever asked that question, I would say, let's do it. And it's certainly something to try. And the question, like we do in our lean practice, will always be, from that action, what have you learned and how will you then cast it forward? And so, yeah, with that, I think I see some stuff in the chat, but I also want to make sure that we leave a little bit of time for questions. And it sounds like Tony has something else to add.
Yeah, I wanted to add to that the whole point of coming together, working together. The dropping below the quote here for a second, the reason we have an image on here that's near and dear to our heart is the sunflowers. We borrow from and build from biomimicry. Biomimicry, in terms of the sunflower, every morning is facing the sun. So not only be with us on the path, be with us on the field. Follow that sunrise as a sunflower. What does that look like in terms of sunset in the field? They're all facing also the sunset. And on that cloud dark day, what do the sunflowers do? they face each other for energy to think about being in the field, taking that first step of whatever that means for you. Hopefully you're able to take one thing away that resonated from you in terms of this, this webinar. Reach out to us. Let's be on the path together. Let's be on the field, and let's make a difference in terms of whatever that looks like in terms of how we define it. So I just want to close with a lot of gratitude for all of you taking your time this evening, the Results Washington team in terms of helping us position that. And again, just always grateful for shared learning together in terms of whatever that looks like. So back to the Results Washington team, or any other questions, we're here and available.
Okay, first I just have to say thank you for that breakdown and that explanation of the sunflowers. I can totally visualize them all facing the sun, getting the light from the sun, and on a dark day, extending that light back to each other. So what an awesome explanation and analogy. And also thank you. I really appreciate you both for the fluency that you delivered this great message. You can really tell you're not just reading or teaching, but you actually live it. You live it, you breathe it, and you're just exuding with exemplary modeling. I thank you so much for this amazing presentation. I've gotten lots of messages on the side of this is inspiring and this is great. And so I just feel you all need to know that, because it is amazing. And even though I'm sitting here soaking it all up, I know I will go back and listen to this again. So thank you both. I do have a couple questions to ask. One is, any advice for how to deal with defensiveness when trying to propose a change?
You want to go ahead, Elizabeth? You're on a
Yeah,
roll in
so
terms of let's bring
yeah,
both the academic and the practitioner side.
yeah,
So work your magic.
yeah. So first of all, I would just say that let's bring it back to the idea of uncertainty and, being with what it feels like for ourselves to walk into change, and just acknowledging that any of us find some defensiveness there. I know I do. And so that's a very normal thing. And sometimes I think that is the actual idea, is walking into it and knowing that what you're trying to do is, remind me the language that you used, Talia, in the question.
Yeah, so the question was, any advice for how to deal with defensiveness when trying to propose a change?
Beautiful. So how do we shift our mindset from proposing a change to creating a change?
Mm,
Right. And so when we meet resistance because we've proposed a change, that's often because we've proposed a change.
mm,
Right. And it's a signal to us that no matter how wonderful our practice is, and this happens to me too, right, we've passed someone. That means that somebody has not come with us. And so how do we also take a step back to say, hey, come along with me, and we're going to move into this change, rather than I'm here to propose it. And those can be really tiny, tiny differences.
Y'all are taking me to change management church. I'm telling you right now, when you when you talk, I see visuals, and I think there's got to be other people on this call that can see visuals when you're talking, and that really helps the message to resonate. So I so appreciate the way you all explain everything. Thank you for that. Okay, the next question. How do we combat the sense of urgency in our work when culture change can take time?
You want to take that one, Tony?
Yeah, maybe ask the question one more time for everyone, because I highlighted the word time there, and I want to make sure that I'm not focusing just on time, but truly the essence of the question. So maybe one more time for me, please.
Truly, how do we combat the sense of urgency in our work when culture change can take time?
I would get really curious about the sense of urgency. I'd be really curious about how that comes together in terms of a shared vision. And I think the skill sets that I would lean on would be really getting curious, asking questions, and think about, do we have time now? Why you? Why now? And why do we take maybe one first step to be able to get towards that? So it's just